I'm going to experiment on you with this PowerPoint presentation. It's a whole different program I'm using. I've never used it away from home. And so if it normally works with Wi-Fi, and we don't have Wi-Fi connected right now here. So we'll see if it works. Hopefully it will. It looks dark up there to me. It looks really good on my screen, but hopefully you all can read that. As we looked at these texts earlier this morning, we're now going to progress into some practical application. We won't look at as many texts. We'll reference several, but we won't look at quite as many. And when you look at the religious world as a whole and Christianity in its broadest, by its broadest definition, the eldership does not play a significant role in leadership in the religious world. And even among churches that claim, and there are churches besides Churches of Christ that would have an eldership in terms of leading local groups of people, those elderships have been reduced to, in many cases, nothing more than short-term board members whose responsibility is fiscal and maintaining books and making sure things stay in the black, making sure things run smoothly. And that's totally foreign to the New Testament perspective of what leaders of the people of God should be about the business of concentrating on. I'm not saying we should be financially irresponsible by any stretch of the imagination, but the primary role of elders is not making sure the church stays in the black and has a cushion of 3 to 6 months operating expenses. Matter of fact, I get real uncomfortable having the Lord's money sitting there doing absolutely nothing. And I'd much rather use it and use it profitably to the Lord's glory, because I believe that He'll open the storehouses of heaven if we do that. And we'll not be in positions where we have to worry about one day the air conditioner is going to break and what are we going to do? Hey, think about that for a minute. Just think about that, as Mark said last night, is a first world problem. And do you think the Lord's really all that concerned about our comfort with respect to air conditioning and whether or not we're going to have the funds available to pay for that? And yet so many places and so many circumstances, successful elderships have been viewed in terms of, well, we're in the black and we've got some degree of peace. And I know peace is important, but sometimes peace at any price isn't peace at all. And we've got to be careful about what we've reduced spiritual leadership to among the people of God. The role, the model in the Old and New Testaments is that of a pastoral or shepherding eldership, as we've seen. And although many churches have an eldership, it's not pastoral by most accounts. So we're going to try and define biblical leadership in this section from a practical level. And we need to start by looking at the fact that leadership all right, this isn't going to work. Okay, I just won't be able to use that. It's pastoral leadership. We're keepers of sheep. And it's our role to protect and to feed and to lead and to help meet the needs of those people over which we shepherd or lead. And we, using these broad pastoral categories, we want to look at what does that look like on a practical level. So let's look at leading for just a moment. This matter of pastoral eldering and leading. In biblical language, shepherding had to do with leading. We already noted that in the various texts we'd looked at before. Notice another text with referencing David and his kingship in 2 Samuel 5, verse 2. The people are talking. The heads of the families, the elders of Israel, are talking to David. And they say, in times past when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel. And so this idea of leading the people of God, shepherding the people of God, has to do with elders leading. And we lead by how we live our lives, which are why those characteristics in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus are so vital and so important. Now, let me say this about those. That doesn't mean the elder has to be the most of all of those things. He just has to be those things. He doesn't have to be the most knowledgeable. He doesn't have to be the most hospitable. He doesn't have to be the most of what you follow the enumeration in the list. He doesn't have to be the most. He has to be those things. And he has to be out front leading in those ways, because that's part of his responsibility, is to lead the people of God. David did that. He led Israel in and out. He brought them in and out. And he was going to then serve as a shepherd of the people of God. You look at Psalm 78, verse 71 and 72. From following the nursing ewes, he brought him to shepherd Jacob, his people, Israel, his inheritance. With upright heart he shepherded them and guided them with his skillful hand. Guiding the people of God, helping them get from their infancy in Christ to their maturity in Christ, helping them get from the struggle with temptation and sin to where we're never free of that in the flesh. We're clay vessels, and we have fissures and we have cracks, and we're always going to have, as long as we are in the flesh, there's going to be a struggle, because Satan goes around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. That never stops. I wish it did. I wish I could say at 60, he's finally quit. He's given up on me. He realizes he's lost the battle. No, he doesn't stop. He's relentless. Nature of the temptations change, maybe, and my ability to be aware of them quicker and to ward them off, certainly, I would like to think, at least has improved. And my ability to resist with each successive year of growth and each hurdle overcome and each battle fought. And even though I've been bloodied and bruised in the battle, each one of those enables me to stand a little firmer the next time he assaults me. But the assaults never stop. And there are times when I have to ask my God to forgive me, and I have to ask my wife to forgive me. I have to ask my brethren to forgive me. And if a leader ever gets to the point where he is incapable of asking for that forgiveness, it's time for him to step down. Because that's part of leading the people. If I can't come to you and say I'm sorry and lead you in how that's to be done, how are you going to ever learn how to do it yourself? A leader has to be able to do that. He has to be able to guide the people in these kinds of things, in these kinds of ways, so that they can deal with the onslaughts of the wicked one, so they can mature, so they can, yes, they're going to be bloodied and they're going to be bruised. And sometimes we're going to stand side by side with them as leaders, helping them fight that battle. And some of the bruises we're going to take, some of the blood we're going to shed, and I have to admit, the Hebrew writer asked the question, have you yet resisted unto blood? No, not literally, but I've shed a lot of tears alongside of some people. And I've come home and I felt physically exhausted. I felt physically beat up, exhausted and mentally beat up. But you've got to stand there with these folks, and you've got to help them fight those battles. You've got to show them how important it is to take a stand, how important it is to face those issues, not run from them, not hide from them, but to face them. And, when you do that, you start to look like and smell like sheep, which is what the Lord intends all along, because we're to be about the business of leading. We're to be among the sheep. We're to be with the sheep. We're to be leading these sheep, not driving them, not pushing them, not pontificating from an ivory tower somewhere, saying, here's what you must do, here's what you must do. And the difference in the reaction of the people, I believe, will be enormous when we find leaders who lead like this. And I don't have this down. I'm learning. I'm still learning at 60 how to do this. And Mark made the observation to me that he remembers hearing me a number of years ago where this would not have necessarily been my focus. I would have had the cart before the horse. And part of that is I've just learned. I've made some adjustments. I've made some changes because I believe my thinking was not strictly in line with what our Lord taught. But not only do we lead, we have the responsibility to feed. Again, you look at modern church circumstances with what leadership they have in place, and even some among us, elders aren't feeding the church of God. They're more boardroom elders. They're more fiscally responsible type individuals. But even among those qualities that these men are to possess is the ability to teach. Again, I don't think he has to be the best teacher in the group. He has to have the ability to teach. And he has to know what needs to be taught to help people get from point A to point B. To help people deal with the real problems of life, not perceived problems, not this, again, Mark last night dealt well with this idea of the kinds of things we feel, and does this make me feel good? I need to learn that I have to adapt my feelings to the will of God rather than try and twist and pervert the will of God to satisfy my feelings. And elders need to be able to know the difference in people, to know, is this a real problem? Is this a real need? Or is this some felt issue that we really need to address on a whole nother level? And we need to know how to get people from point A to point B by feeding them the right things that they need. I don't necessarily have to do the feeding myself, although I think in many cases I will. But the feeding doesn't have to be done on Sunday, doesn't have to be done on Wednesday. That feeding can be done on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And elders who leave the feeding of the group up to what happens on Sunday and Wednesday are no different than parents who hope their kids are going to get the picture of the gospel by what they learn in Bible class on Sunday and Wednesday, and they don't do anything with them any other time of the week. Your kids aren't going to get it. If they do, it's an exception to the rule. And folks, if we're going to lead people, and we think they're going to get all they need to get on Sunday and Wednesday, we're fooling ourselves. I'm not saying you have to be in everybody's home every day of the week, but feeding has to go on in other forms and in other ways, or we're not doing our job. Paul wrote again, he spoke to the Ephesian elders in Acts chapter 20, verse 28, pay careful attention to yourself and to all the flock over which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to care for, to pastor. The idea there is to feed these people, to make provision for them, to care for the church of God, which he obtained with his own blood. And when you consider the price that was paid to obtain these people, I need to be very serious about the matter of feeding them and making sure of what they're fed. It's not, we can't afford a spiritual diet of light, fluffy stuff that makes us feel good but really doesn't give us anything substantial. I could sit down at night and I could sit there with a bag of cheese puffs and a chocolate malt with extra malted, and I could be happy. I'm not going to be healthy. And I'm probably not going to live real long doing that. And if we're feeding our people, if our people are being fed on spiritual cheese puffs and chocolate malts with extra malted, they're not going to survive. They're not going to survive spiritually in this life, and eternity, heaven will not be their home. And that'll be our responsibility as leaders, whether we're recognized as leaders in terms of being shepherds and elders or pastors, or whether we're leaders in some other sense of the term. And in some ways, if you're a husband and a father, you're a leader. You may not like leadership responsibility, then you shouldn't have got married. Because as soon as you said, I do, you signed up for leadership on some level. And the moment you agree to teach a Bible class, you signed up for leadership on some level. The moment you stand up here and are going to direct the people of God in song, you signed up for leadership on some level. And in even lesser senses, when we go out into the community and our light is to shine, when you went down into the water of baptism and you arose to walk in newness of life, you signed up for leadership on some level. So it ought not to be hard, if we all understand that truth, to start looking out among us and seeing those men who are actually doing this on a day in, day out basis, and who understand this servant perspective, and who are interested in feeding themselves, feeding their families, making sure others are fed in ways that are helping them grow. Again, Peter in 1 Peter 5:2, shepherd the flock of God which is among you, exercising the oversight. The idea here, though, again, of shepherding and feeding is vital. It's important that we, as leaders, make sure people are fed and fed properly. We also have this matter of protecting. There's this component of local church leadership that is incredibly significant, protecting the flock of God. We live in a world where people don't like us getting up into their business. And sometimes that makes it hard, and sometimes elders pull back, and we don't involve ourselves in the lives of people to suggest that maybe that activity in your family's life just really isn't as healthy spiritually as it can be. There's a danger here. And we at least need to, at the very least, we need to make you aware of the danger. And we need, if you're going to give us any opportunity, we need to help you see what other alternatives you have, and maybe how you need to steer away from this and steer in this direction. Because if you keep going on that path, you drive little Sally all over the place for gymnastics. And sometimes that takes you away on a Sunday, or sometimes it takes you away on a Wednesday. Be aware of the reality that little Sally's never going to make her living doing gymnastics. Little Sally, in all likelihood, isn't going to be an Olympic gymnast. Not to mention the fact that she's probably dressing in a way that as little Sally develops, you're not going to want her dressing like that. She wouldn't have any business dressing like that. And I know people say, oh, you're getting into my business now. This is my family life, and you don't. I watch out for your souls. Elders watch out for your souls. And they have to protect you sometimes from yourself. And now we don't like that, and we're uncomfortable with it because we want our space and we want to do our thing. And I'm not saying that it's wrong to participate in sports. I picked a rather obvious one because it has more alarms that go off than just being gone on Sunday and Wednesday. But you can pick anything you want. And we need to revolve, our lives need to revolve around the cross and around the Christ who died on that cross, not around our children's sports activities, their extracurricular activities. And when our children learn that we're going to mold our lives as Christians around their activities, what do you think they're going to do? Because the next generation always goes one step farther than we're comfortable going with, usually. If we're lucky, they only go one. Sometimes they go 2, 3, 4, 10 steps farther than we would ever go. And what are we teaching them from a very young age when we're going to revolve our whole world around them and their activities rather than around the Christ and His cross? And we're not just talking, when we talk about protecting, we normally think about false doctrine, and those are all part of the procedure, but there's a whole lot more to it than that. And elders need to be involved in helping people understand that when wolves come, they don't always come in the form of a Calvinist. They don't always come in the form of a premillennialist or any other kind of ist you want to stick on the end of some word that comes before it. Sometimes they come in ways that might seem perfectly all right in and of themselves. But because we allow ourselves to get wrapped up and consumed, and our priorities start to shift, that's just as much a wolf as anything else. And elders need to be involved in protecting the flock, sometimes even from their own selves. Not just from the wolf who comes in from the outside and who says, I don't believe that baptism is essential for the remission of sins. Or the wolf who comes in and says, I think we need to liven up our assemblies. I'd like to have a band up here, or whatever the case might be. Sometimes it's these other things that we shy away from. It's having the conversation with the brother who we've excused for 30 years of his cantankerous mean-spirited approach to things because, well, that's just who he is. He's always been that way. And we just kind of learned to not ruffle his feathers and tiptoe lightly around him. You haven't done that brother a favor. He may go to hell because of his cantankerous mean-spiritedness. And we've kind of prided ourselves on the fact that we've been able to learn how to tap dance around it and function without ruffling his feathers. The fact that we have to tap dance and not ruffle feathers ought to send out alarms to us that say, I need to love this fellow enough to talk to him about this. His soul's in danger. I need to protect him. And we need to protect the rest of the flock, because what's the rest of the flock learning? Oh, we don't really deal with problems. We just tiptoe around them and not ruffle feathers. And that's not healthy. And so we need to be, and the more you involve in those kind of things, you really start to smell like sheep, sorry. Stink's probably more right, but you start to smell like sheep. That wasn't really a faux pas. I intended to do that, for those of you who might not have known. I'm going to go through this here and get us to the next point. That talks about all of the protecting and the warning that Paul did in Acts 20 with the Ephesian elders. But we talked about that a little last night. We've already addressed it this morning. Sometimes we have to just help meet practical needs of people. People have problems that may not be spiritual on the surface. They are spiritual when you really get down to the root of the problem. But you've got to help them with the practical things as you're dealing with the spiritual things. And sometimes there are people who just are a mess with money. Don't know how, they spend more than they bring in. And all of a sudden they come to the brethren and they say, well, Acts 2 says we're to have all things in common. I can't make them my payment on this new TV I got, 90 days, same as cash. Can the church give me the money? No, the church can't give you the money. The church is going to sit down with you. The elders are going to sit down with you and help you figure out how you got in this mess. I don't want that. I just want you to know, because all we're going to do is create a monster that just keeps on wanting to be fed. We're going to keep on helping somebody spend more than they bring in. And what we really need to do is sit down with them and help them to learn self-discipline. We need to help them to learn that God expects them to be fiscally responsible, financially responsible. And we need to help them get to that point. That can be messy. And then when you have to tell people you are spending more than you're making and you haven't handled your money well. How many of you would like to hear that? You know, all of a sudden the hair stands up on the back of your neck and you rear back. But if you care for people, and if you love people enough, you're going to help them meet their practical needs. I don't know how much more practical it gets than whether or not you can pay your rent or your house payment, whether or not you can put food on the table, and whether or not you can provide for those kinds of necessities of life. And it's difficult at times. But that's the kind of things that we're looking for in men who are going to lead, men who are going to be willing to do those difficult type of things and do them in such a way. Sometimes we're going to be offensive no matter how we do it. People are just going to take offense, and you can use every precaution and every measure imaginable to you to not be offensive, and some people are going to be offended. We can't help that. But we don't have to go in and call people knuckleheads and stupid, and, you know, that's not going to be helpful either. But we've got to be willing to help, even when it's going to be uncomfortable, even when it is not necessarily going to initially be appreciated. That's, you know, the sheep who starts to wander off because he sees the literal sheep, he sees some little green patch over yonder that separates him from the rest of the flock. He's not going to want the shepherd's crook around his neck yanking him back. But that's what the shepherd's responsibility is to go over and get that sheep that's wandering and bring him back to the fold. And you can wander in more ways than just doctrinal wandering. So I'm not focusing on the obvious this morning. You should be able to tell that by now. Those are the obvious things that we would all do this with. I'm going to talk about some things that we're all not always comfortable talking about, but need to be addressed anyway, and we need to find men willing to do those kinds of things. And then, besides helping with practical needs of that sort, raising children, sometimes we're talking to grandparents and raising grandchildren. They didn't really do a good job the first time. That's why they're having to do it the second time, and they're not doing a real good job the second time. And so you've got to help folks like that, and that's just the way things are. But This involves sacrificing. And again, this is where that Sherpa idea comes in. This can be grueling, time-consuming, giving up of your own comforts and your own desire type activity. If you're not willing to do that, don't sign up for this. If you're not willing to do that, second of all, and maybe it should be flip-flop, why? What did Jesus do for you? Did he do was it comfortable for him to leave the glories and the beauty and the wonder of heaven in the very presence of the Father, where there's no sin and there's no dying and there's no death, to take on a body and live like we live? Do you think that was comfortable for him? Do you think that was something that I know he looked forward to it in one sense? I don't always understand the fullness of this phrase, but for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. And you can wrestle with all the implications of what the joy set before him means. But yet he came and he lived like me. He endured things that no human being should have to endure, especially an innocent human being. And he endured it because of people like me and people like you and choices we've made and things that we've done. And if he's willing to do all of that for me, and he calls me to imitate him, don't I have to be willing to do that for others? So I need to just do a self-examination about my relationship with my God if I'm unwilling to sacrifice and to be inconvenienced and to have to do some unpleasant things. So maybe I need to start there and just, okay, why am I having a hard time with this? Then I need to say, okay, since I'm having a hard time with this, I'm going to exclude myself until I get over that from serving in those kind of capacities. But when we view elders as a board position or some sort of status symbol, you're going to have plenty of volunteers. When people begin to realize that this is sacrificial, that this is the giving up of some of your own self and your own time and your own resources, well, then some people are going to step back. And unfortunately, what happens in many cases, don't let that happen here, but what happens in many cases is those people, because they don't want to do that, they also don't want you in that position that they're unwilling to take. And so they're going to find every reason under the sun not to have elders. And they're going to start picking at you. I can remember one case in Minnesota where I first served as an elder when we lived up in St. Paul. I just, in a sermon one time, I had mentioned that I used to play hockey and I got in a fight when I was a hockey player. That was, at that time, it was only 25 years ago. Now it's 40-some years ago. Well, lo and behold, we were going to appoint elders. I was going to be one of them, and do you know what came up? Keith is quick to anger because he got in a fight as a hockey player when he was 18 years old. What does that tell you about that individual? He's looking for a reason not to have elders. He's looking for a way to disqualify, if you will, someone serving as an elder. He did that with actually all three of us. He found some little isolated incident that happened years ago in everybody's life, and those were the things that he was picking out as reasons why we shouldn't have elders. We were fortunate that the men of the congregation, none of the three of us who were in front of the group being set forth to serve, none of us were going to insist that if that's the only objection, we insist we're going to serve. None of us were of that mindset. But the men said, "Are you kidding us?" And they dealt with that individual and they dealt with his quibble. That's what they called it, a quibble, and elders were appointed. Don't let that be a part of the picture here. Because somebody who can't serve or who's unwilling to serve because they understand it takes this kind of circumstance, don't let them derail the process. So when we recognize these kinds of practical things, eldering becomes a whole different ball of wax for a lot of people. But let's look at servant leadership a little more closely here. Unfortunately, just as Christianity influenced the Roman Empire, the whole Greco-Roman world system also affected the course of Christianity. You can see that when you start to look at parallels between Roman Catholicism and the Roman Empire and their political structures. You can see how ancient Rome affected the religious culture of the day and the eventual development of Roman Catholicism. But I'm convinced that those changes over the decades and the centuries of the early church have actually proved to be disastrous. And we haven't necessarily overcome all of them in our effort to become what God calls us to be. We need to understand that when we are talking about Christianity, we're talking about something that has at its very root, at its very heart, this idea of loving service. I don't think you can talk about genuine biblical love without discussing this matter of serving. Those two ideas are inseparably connected. You can't tell me that you love me and are unwilling to serve me if that is necessary. And if I'm going to function as an elder in a local church, I'm not doing my job. I can't tell you that I love you if I'm not willing to serve you. That means I'm going to wash your feet if necessary. And it is necessary. And when I said wash your feet, I meant literally, as opposed to the metaphor of serving that's intended by that text. If it comes to the point of even washing your feet, clipping your toenails, whatever the case. You think of the grungiest, most awful thing you might have to do to help serve somebody. And Christianity calls each of us as believers to be willing to do that very thing. Because that's what our Lord did. And that's what He calls us to do. Washing disciples' feet on the night. You would think on the night before His death, He would be expecting them to somehow cater to Him. After all, He's the one who's going to die on a cross in just a few hours for the sins of those very men. And yet it's He who gets onto His knees and cleans their feet in that circumstance. And we're called to do the same thing. When you and I read the Gospels, what we see in the Gospels are principles of love and humility and service. Do we see that in the family of believers we're a part of? Or is our intermingling with one another relegated to worship services? And that's all the kind of service we do when we come and we sing. I'm not diminishing that. It's vital. I can wake up Sunday not feeling well, be grumpy, and by the time I've spent 2.5 hours with my brethren studying and singing and praying, I can leave a whole different person. And that's the work of God. That's not me. And so we're not going to diminish from that. But if that's all of the service that we offer, we've missed the heart of New Testament Christianity, because it's service that we engage in with one another. It's activity that we engage in with one another beyond the four walls of this building. And we need to find men who are doing that on a regular basis. And Bill asked all of you if you knew who those men were who were aspiring to be elders. And if you didn't, you needed to start looking out for them. I want to suggest to all of you who aspire to be elders, if these people don't know who you are, you need to start reaching out to them. You need to start involving yourself in their lives so they know who you are. Not because you're making a name for yourself. Not because you want everybody to see you're so good and you're so important. But if this really matters to you, if this is really important to you, then you're going to be serving everybody, not a select few. And it's going to be apparent to others that you have this desire and this willingness. Christ-like elders are not despots. We're not here to rule and to domineer, to dominate over people. I'm getting ahead of myself here. We have already talked about the effect the culture had on church leadership. We talked about the gospel-centered service. Sometimes I get, as Bill said yesterday, I begin to wax the elephant and forget that I have visuals here that I want to show you in the process. So There is this warning in Peter to men who are going to function in this capacity. We've read over it twice without making a lot of comment, but I want to comment now about 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 3. Not domineering over those in your charge. One of the earliest mistakes I made as a husband was saying to Kathy, God made me the head of this house. We're going to do it this way. The hurt on her face. And unfortunately, remember the dumb sheep I had to hit in the head with the bales of hay? I probably did that more than once. And I can still see the expression on her face each time I'd play my trump card. It doesn't work in the home, and it's not going to work as a shepherd of God's people. To throw down, I'm the overseer, we're the overseers, and you're going to do what we tell you you have to do. That's exactly what he's talking about. He says, don't do that. Not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. If my leadership is going to be effective at all, it's going to be because people see me doing these kinds of things that I talk about that are important for us as the people of God to be doing. And if they see me doing something different than what they hear me telling them we ought to be about the business of doing, well, they may be satisfied with me being in a position and keeping the checkbook in the black, but they're not going to follow me anywhere, and they're not going to go out and do what they need to be doing unless they're an exception to the rule. And I cannot afford to be a self-serving, autocratic despot who's going to sit there and dictate and demand and to be overbearing about what we're going to do because that's what we've decided and we don't care what anybody else thinks about the matter. Now, sometimes elders will have to make tough decisions after they get input and they find out that, no, some people don't think that that's really the right thing to do or the best thing to do. Elders are going to have to pray, and they're going to have to study, and they're going to have to talk together, and they may come to a conclusion that's different than everybody else's, or that's different than a significant number of other people's. And they may come to the conclusion that this is important enough that we need to move ahead. If they've done all of this right, there are going to be people who say, You've listened to us, you've heard our voice, you've let us explain our position. And as a result, because you are the leadership that God has put in place, that's the end of the story. We're going to follow you. We're going to submit because we're told to do that. In Hebrews, we'll look at that at the very end of the lesson. We're told to submit, and we need to do that, and we move on. But we can't do it in a way that seems to be overbearing and pontificating in any way, shape, or form. Elders must be men who can relate to one another. There's cooperation among them. You can't have one elder running roughshod over all the other elders and always being the head guy. The other ones are kind of yes men or lackeys or subservient to him in some way. This is a situation where there has to be this cooperative effort between them, however many of them there are. And there has to be a unified front to the group. If the group doesn't see a unified front from the leadership, how in the world is the group going to be unified behind that leadership to be able to follow their guidance and their direction when they're very aware of the fact that the eldership, however many of them are divided about these matters. But I wish I had I had another hour to talk just about this problem. Because you might have the heart of a shepherd. You may want to be the kind of shepherd we've described, but if you don't make yourself accessible to people, and if you are not approachable, if people aren't comfortable with coming to you, you're never going to be effective in this position. And the lesson I have learned, I'm still figuring out how to make it work in every circumstance. But the 3 L's of real estate, Location, location, location. You want to know the 3 C's of quality leadership among the people of God? Communication, communication, communication. And the less we communicate, the more difficulties we have. Those are one of the things I've learned in serving as an elder. Now, we don't always find the best ways to communicate, and sometimes we get a little frustrated because the ways we've tried, people, I don't like this, I want to go back to that. Well, we don't like that either, but and so you bounce around. But lack of communication is a unity killer. All of a sudden, people start wondering, oh, why are these decisions being made? And why is he going there with that train of thought? What does all of this mean? Because we're not talking about things. We're not sharing a vision. We're not sharing perspectives. We're not talking. And as a result, things just begin to shut down. And when they start to shut down, it's often hard to ramp things back up and get things moving. We need to be accessible, and that means we have to be approachable and we have to be available. We can't tell people, I don't have time for that. I know you work an 8-hour or 10-hour day sometimes and trying to serve as an elder. You've got to make time. You've got to make yourself available. You've got to have a spirit that allows people to come to you and not be hesitant because you're a hard-nosed, straight talker, and that's, sometimes we justify that. I'm to speak the truth, yes, but Paul says in love. And so I've got to find some way to get my straight talk across without being so offensive that you are not comfortable coming to me. And guys, you can't work on this. You can't wait till you're 50 to work on this or 40 to work on this. You need to start working on this. I would even start younger than Jared and Landon, who are young men. I would start working on it, parents, with your children at home, grandparents. Start talking to your grandchildren. Start working with them, not specifically about serving as an elder or being an elder's wife, but those qualities that are important for those people to possess that will help them be the kind of people they need to be. Now, when we get back to this matter of communication, just quickly, sometimes we communicate, but we never connect. Why? Well, that's because I'm on an FM frequency and you're on AM trying to tune me in. And you're never going to hear me. Now, can I do something about that? Yes. Should I do something about that? Absolutely. But so should you. You've got to understand something about how I communicate, as well as me having to understand about how you communicate. This is a two-way street, this matter of communication. And that's true whether we're talking about the radio industry, the television industry, or we're talking about you and I having a conversation about something. It is a two-way street. But we need to be men, and among elderships, there'll be some men who communicate better than others. I was just talking to a school superintendent the other day who was telling me about a circumstance in his community where what the problem is unimportant. But they were going to have a community meeting, town hall meeting, and he and the principal discussed the best way to deal with this problem, and they concluded it was the Jimmy Stewart approach. Mr. Smith goes to Washington kind of approach needed to be done in this particular circumstance. And so the superintendent decided, that's not me. I communicate differently than Jimmy Stewart did in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And the principal was the one who really could pull that kind of communication off. And so the superintendent, who really had the authority to step in and say, I'm going to chair this meeting and I'm going to tell the people what we're going to do, he said, I backed out and I let Jimmy Stewart, that's not the principal's name. Actually, his name was Jim. But he said, I let Jim handle this. And he said, everything went well. It would have had a different outcome had I decided to chair that same meeting. Now, that superintendent is one of our deacons, and he's a good communicator. But in that circumstance, he recognized that it needed a different kind of communication, and this gentleman was better at that kind of communication than he was. That's going to happen. That's okay. It doesn't make one elder qualified and the other one disqualified. And we shouldn't look at it as one is more qualified than the other. We should just look at it that they bring different skill sets to this mix. And what a wonderful thing it is that we can have a plurality of men who bring different levels of skill sets to this package. And they recognize that they have these different skill sets, and they work these kinds of things out so that the communication happens well and it happens effectively. But we have to be able to connect with the people we communicate to, or we're going to have difficulty. Again, I got a little ahead of myself. I want us to go back here for just a moment. For some reason it skipped my text in Hebrews. I need to go back there. There we go. I want us to think about these texts as we close. Hebrews 13:7. Remember your leaders, those who spoke to you the word of God. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. I believe he's talking about elders here. I don't know that it would be limited to elders, but it's certainly inclusive of elders. And elders who rule well are worthy of double honor, Timothy says, or Paul says to Timothy. And here, the writer of Hebrews says you need to remember those who spoke to you the word of God. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. And then skip down to verse 17 of Hebrews 13. Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls. And if you're considering serving in this capacity as an elder, the next phrase needs to just constantly be at the forefront of your mind. Look at the responsibility you have as those who will give an account. I'm going to give an account, not only for myself. I'm going to give an account for those that I oversee, those that I shepherd. And that is a tremendous, tremendous responsibility that sometimes we take far too lightly. But because of that, notice how he finishes the text. Let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you. It's no advantage to you for you to make life miserable for those who are leading you, because that's only going to come back and eventually bite you in the backside before it's all over. There's no advantage to you for that. So he said, you live in such a way that they're able to do this shepherding with joy and not groaning. Because if they're able to do it with joy and they're able to do it with confidence that you hear their voice and you respect their leadership because they're the kind of leaders they ought to be, not just because they have a title, not just because they're in a position, but because of the quality of men they genuinely are, it's going to make for such a harmonious, wonderful relationship. And the God of heaven will prosper that circumstance. He will bless that arrangement. And then it becomes the responsibility of that group with that leadership to perpetuate that process. What we have a tendency to do is we like it like this, and we're moving forward and we're focusing everywhere but on perpetuating that. Perpetuating good leadership has to be a top priority. It has to be right up there with everything else. So we're going to go through the same cycles in our history as the people of God that the Israelites went through in the Judges. And we're going to have those ups and we're going to have those downs. We're going to have wonderfully good times of restoration and righteousness, and then we're going to hit these incredible low points of rebellion and rejection and oppression. And then we'll climb our way back out by the help of God because he sends somebody who helps us back out of the mess and the muck. But if we can keep that leadership in place and keep it functioning, we'll be all that we need to be. Now, I want to turn your attention as we close to Ezekiel 34, verses 11 through 16. And as we talk about ourselves and our relationship to God. For thus says the Lord God, behold, I myself will search for my sheep. God's looking for us. He's desirous of a connection with his creation. And so he's going to search for his sheep. He will seek them out. As a shepherd seeks out his flock when he is among his sheep that have been scattered, so I will seek out my sheep. I will rescue them from all places where they have been scattered. Now, I know he's talking about Israel. But the principle is true beyond Israel and they're being scattered and they're being brought back together. He said, I'm going to rescue them from all the places where they have been scattered on a day of clouds and thick darkness. And I will bring them out from the peoples and gather them from the countries, and I will bring them into their own land, and I will feed them on the mountains of Israel, by the ravines, and in all the inhabited places of the country. I will feed them with good pasture, and on the mountain heights of Israel shall be their grazing land. There they shall lie down in good grazing land. What a similar resonance to Psalm 23 as we read through this. There they shall lay down in good grazing land, and on rich pasture they shall feed on the mountains of Israel. I myself will be the shepherd of my sheep. I myself will make them lie down, declares the Lord. I will seek the lost, and I will bring back the strayed, and I will bind up the injured, and I will strengthen the weak, and the fat and the strong I will destroy. I will feed them in justice. God looks for the lost. God will bring back the straying. God will bind up the injured. He will strengthen the weak. Where are you today in relationship to your God? Are you lost? We all were at one point. Those of us who have come to know Him and yield to Him and respond to Him in baptism are restored, but maybe we've begun to stray. Or maybe we're injured in some way, and we just need healing. We need binding. Our God is desirous of doing that for us. Maybe we realize right now for this season of my life, for some reason I've just gotten weak. And I need that strength that comes only from Him, only from the chief shepherd and what He provides for us. This is the desire of our God, that we be His people, a found people, that we be a people on the right path, that we be a people who are being healed, and that we are people who are getting stronger. And you can avail yourself to that this morning. It's now this afternoon, 10 after 12. You can avail yourself to that today by coming to your God as He bids you to, and we encourage you to while we stand and sing.